I recently had a dinner with a friend to catch up and hear how things were going, and he asked my advice on a personal legal issue that he was involved in with real estate. The other person had taken some money and was supposed to put down a deposit as prime, but didn't do as promised. And he was out the money, and he wanted to know from a minister what he should do. Should he press further with this person, or should he let it go? Before I could answer, he said, I know what you're going to say, Pastor. Forgive and forget. There's more to life than money. All you need is love. Actually, no, I responded. You should demand the money back. If he doesn't pay you, you should engage the authorities and let him know that you're serious about it. His eyes grew wide. What about God being love and loving the neighbor? And I'm surprised, Pastor. But I've got to say, I'm happy to hear what you said. That was a lot of money that he took, and I really need it. I responded, be as wise as a serpent and gentle as doves. He responded, well, that's a really cool phrase. I really like that. Where'd you get that? Jesus, I answered. Then he kind of looked perplexed. He had grown up in the church, and he didn't believe me that Jesus would say something like that. But he really liked it, and we actually had to go into the Bible to find the passage. And then he did proceed to fight to get his funds back, which he did. And that is one of my favorite texts, be wise as serpent and gentle as doves, or as innocent as doves in today's text, depending on what translation. But we've all been taught that all we really need is love in life. The Beatles, the leading theologians of our modern time, the Beatles, said all you need is love. Love is all you need. And each Sunday in my sermons, I stress that the purpose of our lives is to love God and love our neighbor. Swedenborg says that we are love. We are what we love. We gravitate in our life after we pass to the next life to be in a community of people who share our love. Love is really important. So if all that's true, then isn't love just love enough? So my understanding of this text, and I will say it is not necessarily a common interpretation, but at least the way I interpret it, we can discuss later, is I think Jesus is teaching his disciples as they go out into the world that we are to love others, but we have to act with wisdom and be strategic. I believe he marries together the idea of being gentle and being wise. And if that's true, then love, just love, is not enough. The way that I would see it is that our compassion has to be married to wisdom. Love could be the why of what we're doing, but wisdom for me is how we get it done. I've heard it described that love is art, wisdom is the painting. Swedenborg compares the relationship between love and wisdom as the relationship between the lungs and the heart. They're separate, but they need each other. They simply don't work without each other. Love and wisdom require each other. At Church of the Holy City, we've been leading on this idea we call spiritual entrepreneurs, where we're trying to seek and develop our inner life so that we can move in the world from a deep place of love and marry that love to the wisdom and practical strategy to have impact. In my experience, love without wisdom can lead to no action or thoughtless action. And on the other hand, wisdom without love is when we really know the rules, but there's no space in our heart for the reality of compassion. Love and wisdom together provide the complexity of how things really work. And you all know I've done work in politics, and I find very often in politics, this polarity takes place in the work that I've done. There's people more on the wisdom truth side and people more on the compassion side. When they work together, we get really great results. But I've seen numerous policies where it hasn't worked out that way. I've seen folks who believe that just because they're leading a good cause, that they'll win the day without really any thought or strategy of how to change the rules. They didn't have any wisdom of how to get things done. Other people have been thinking that just because they're wise and they speak the truth, those idiots on the other side should just get in line, but they've lacked compassion. Being wise as serpent and gentle as doves became a biblical guiding passage for me. At least from my perspective, when we give some money to someone who asks and we know that they might be killing themselves with drugs or alcohol, we know that our funds could likely contribute to that downward spiral. But we want to feel good in that moment. And so we do it, and we're not really focused on the outcome. That's compassion without wisdom. When we lecture a young person, very often, usually it's a young person, about the mistakes they've made. For example, when we lecture young women who have gotten pregnant, or young people who make the mistakes that young people do, and we do it in such a rules-based, truth-based perspective, we miss the chance to show compassion and remind them that we too made similar mistakes at their age. With government programs often set out to helping the poor, many perpetuate dependence and a loss of dignity. That's compassion, but not truth, and they don't usually work. Policies that put children in cages because of their immigration status point to the truth of the immigration law, but they lack any compassion. Concerning the recent racial protests, an African-American dean of Stanford, Brian Lowry, wrote in the op-ed this morning in the Washington Post, "To my white friend, the time for talk has passed. Now it's time for work." He said, "Maybe you believe the diverse activism on display nationwide will make things right. But sincere concern and time have not fixed our problems. They are not enough to protect us from the influence of a malignant system that we live in." In this current moment where we're more aware of our responsibility to end racism, it's going to require leaders who can lead with love, guided by wisdom. These leaders are becoming increasingly hard to find. This past week, I joined a group of clergy leaders from across the country, representing over 100,000 church members, to discuss how they would move on the issue of ending racism through their church. We had a chance to hear from the Reverend Jeffrey Brown, a Baptist pastor from Boston, whose engagement with the police and gangs there has led to what was called the Boston Miracle, where they dramatically reduced gang violence. He spoke about what he learned and what churches can do. I was particularly curious to hear Jeffrey because this is really strange. He and I go way back. He went to the same college as I did, East Stroudsburg University of Pennsylvania. And I'm guessing that the two of us were the only two ministers that ever graduated from that school. He was a year ahead of me, and he was class president, so I remembered him. And then years later, when I was at Memorial Church at Harvard, he was the pastor of the Baptist Church in Central Square, Cambridge, and I came and attended his church. And we've stayed connected a little bit, but it was really amazing to hear what a gift he's been to God and what he's been accomplishing in his life. Though all of his comments were interesting in the presentation that he gave, what struck me was when he spoke to the fact he succeeded by marrying his compassion to understanding and teaching about the complexity of what was happening. For example, when he met with the police, he told the story of each young person in the community in all of their complexity. Through his teaching about the truth of who these young people were, they moved from being thugs, as the police officers saw them, and were transformed into human beings with complex life stories. By marrying that wisdom and teaching to compassion, and his compassion to wisdom, he was able to reduce gang violence by 79%. It's a paradox, most spiritual teachings are, that leaders today must revive complexity in a time of false simplicity, while at the same time embracing simplicity in our lifestyle in a time of complexity. Religion needs to find that balance as well. Even in our own Swedenborgian tradition, which I know many of you don't know the details of, but it's kind of interesting. We have a split even in the Swedenborgian tradition. One is called the General Convention, in which we're part of, and the other is called the General Church. In our branch, we emphasize more on the teachings from compassion. We're often, to be honest, less knowledgeable and maybe even less interested in the deeper study of Swedenborg's teachings. But there's very strong compassion and inclusion, but maybe not as strong in the area of wisdom. And yet in the other branch, the General Church, I would suggest they're often much more knowledgeable theologically and have a grasp of that truth. But they have policies to discriminate against women and gays from being ordained in their church. So stronger in wisdom, but less strong, I would say, in compassion. I think the two branches could learn from one another by bringing these two together. When love and wisdom get separated, they lead to simplistic solutions that lead often to extremism. Extremism often leads to evil. Cancel culture, which is when you try to cancel someone who you, in the public life, you disagree with, is an example of that, and it's on the rise. Rather than finding the ways to see the complexity in each other and disagree, we gather our mob, often on Twitter, and destroy people whose viewpoints we disagree with. Compassion with wisdom embraces the complexity, and we can see numerous perspectives. Love is not enough. Wisdom is not enough. Action is not enough. Love must be married to wisdom that leads to action in our life in the world. That marriage and balance of love and wisdom needs to begin within each of us. When we feel ourselves judgmental and sure that we are right, we can take a breath and ask God for more compassion. When we feel ourselves moved by caring to the point of no boundaries, we can take a breath and ask God for more wisdom. It has to start with each of us. When we do this, we can more deeply care about one another and act wisely to solve systemic problems that the world faces. When we embrace love and wisdom, we can be both wise as serpent and gentle as doves. Amen.